Betsy, welcome to the Mindset Advantage podcast. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time. I am so impressed with you, your competence, the way you communicate, and your new book is phenomenal. And I don't just say that just to say that because you're here. I had a chance to read a pre-copy or pre-order of the book, and thank you for sending that out my way. It is one of the best books that I have read in the last couple of years. Congratulations on the success. I can't wait for my listeners to get their hands on it, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much. Likewise, I've been looking forward to this conversation. And again, I so appreciate the kind words about the book. It's been a little overwhelming how many people have already ordered. We've sold over 1,000 in the pre-order and it's been 2 weeks. But just the number of people that have said, yeah, this matters. Like, I need this yesterday. Please, can I have it? I'm so excited for it to be in the world, just to do whatever good it stands to do. So thank you.
So the new book is titled Kids These Days, Effective Strategies for Coaching Gen Z and Beyond. We're going to get into a ton of strategies. The book is filled with strategies and action items that you can go do today. Before we get into that, I was stopped in my tracks a little bit on the opening page. You had a quote that I thought was brilliant and just is a great place for us to start today, Betsy. The quote is, "While it is not your responsibility, you have an incredible opportunity. While it is not your responsibility, you have an incredible opportunity." Why did you decide to start the book that way?
Honestly, DJ, that's the thing that felt most true. And I also wanted to be intentional about acknowledging there's so much on coaches' plates these days at all level of sport, across sports, that this can very much feel like one more thing. Betsy, I don't have time to learn how to, connect better with Gen Z, with Gen Alpha. Like, I don't have time. Time is always a big factor. And it's also an acknowledgement of what we do as coaches, what we do as educators, and I very much view coaches as educators. We have such a unique opportunity to impact a life for the rest of that life. And it's rare. Like, I feel like parents or caregivers have that opportunity. Teachers have that opportunity. Coaches absolutely have that opportunity. And so while it can feel like one more thing, and it was not in your job description, you have an incredible opportunity to lean into what not only connects, but also elevates the quality of the experience, not just for the athletes on your roster, but for you as a coach as well. And there's that spoken and unspoken desire to return to more joy, greater ease in the profession. And so for me, that's what felt most true to say before we got into any portion of how could we actually do that as coaches.
And I love the title, Kids These Days. That's one of those
Yeah.
phrases that you and I, we do workshops around the country, and we probably hear that phrase get uttered more than we'd like. And it's probably one of those ones that kind of makes you a little bit angry when you hear that. For me, I hate the term must be nice, Betsy. I hate when people say must be nice. That really irks me. I could imagine maybe kids these days might be kind of the same for you. Betsy, what's the response or reaction when you hear kids these days, and why are coaches leaning on that phrase so much?
That's one of the opening exercises that I do in both workshops that I have around kids these days, is I invite the audience to fill in the phrase kids these days with whatever is true in their experience. And I'll say, before I do that, I typically ask, I set the precedent of, when we're talking about Gen Z, we're talking about individuals born during or after 1997, unique hallmark, never known life without the internet. And then I'll pause and say, by show of hands, how many of you in the room today were born during or after 1997? So hands go up and I say, okay, you don't have to be a communications specialist to know it's a very awkward situation when people talk about you as if you're not in the room. So I want to start by saying, hi, I'm Betsy, and now we're going to talk about you. But then I also add, if anything you hear or experience today feels in some way like a misrepresentation of who you take yourself or your generational peers to be, please make that known, because it's incredibly important that I am advocating on your behalf and representing you accurately. And then I'll invite the audience to fill in the phrase kids these days. Sometimes we do it live and I'll pass the mic down a row. Sometimes I'll throw up a Mentimeter poll so it comes up anonymously. Without fail, most of what's on the screen is much more critical than it is celebratory. There are so many, I'll say judgments, because that's really what they are. Judgments about Gen Z, about kids these days. Things I hear commonly. They're soft, they're entitled, they lack resilience, they don't want to work that hard, but they say they want these, high achievements, or they have these high goals. There is so much criticism about kids these days and why they are the way they are. And that really, for me, has been a foundational part as an educator, is How do we start by replacing judgment with understanding? And then from there, as educators, be intentional about meeting them where they are, not to lower the bar or our standards or expectations, but if we hope to teach them, we first need to reach them. So starting where they are, creating the relationship, the connection that allows us to then help them upskill and to do the hard work that we know life is going to require of them, separate from their sport. So I hear kids these days, for me, the curiosity flag goes up. It's like, oh yeah, tell me more. Like, how would you finish that phrase? What about kids these days? And then getting curious about when and where and how was that judgment formed? And how can we substitute understanding for judgment so that that judgment no longer becomes a barrier to that coach being effective with the athlete in front of them?
One of my favorite quotes of all time, Walt Whitman, be curious, not judgmental. And that, I think that curious door is sometimes more difficult than the judgmental door. It's easy to kind of sit back and place judgment, place blame. Hey, kids these days, it's much harder to choose the curious route, to meet them where they're at, to coach the kid that you have, not the kid that you wish you had. I think one of the challenges too, Betsy, with coaching is that we as coaches, we're getting older, but the kids are staying the same age. And so there's this forever gap that's only going to keep increasing if we're talking about college or high school. So the further older that we get, the more, disconnection that there could be, which means it's probably harder to relate the older that we get. So and in addition to that, the older you get or the further away we get from them, perhaps the harder it is for them to trust you, relate to you. Hey, you don't know what I'm going through because it's been X amount of years since you've been in my shoes. So in your experience, in your research, Betsy, what are one or two things that you think modern athletes have to go through or experience that we as coaches didn't have to go through or experience?
Great question. And you mentioned that spectrum of like, we're going to keep getting older, so the gap's just going to get wider. I also see the other side. As members of Gen Z specifically start to enter the coaching profession, this is also, in a way, becoming a finite problem. So there's two ways to look at it. One of the, I'll say, baselines for understanding that I set in the book and in the workshops is we first have to understand that while we, as older generations, and I'm born in 83, so that makes me an elder millennial. While we have experienced the same changes in technology as the athletes that we're coaching today, the way in which we experience them, the timing in our own personal development at which we experience them is vastly different. Because that's part of the barriers when we talk about judgment or a lack of understanding is, Betsy, yeah, I was alive when the internet became a thing and I've experienced the same changes in technology. So how come kids these days are showing up so differently? What we need to understand is because of the time and at the time of their life that kids these days experience technology, what's resulted is Gen Z, Gen Alpha have had fewer opportunities than older generations to practice certain skills that were much more innate. And so one of the things that I offer to coaches is anytime you find yourself frustrated by something that you perceive today's athletes to lack, I'd love for you to consider it's not impossible. It's simply unpracticed. And then the invitation becomes, okay, as an educator, how can I, through their sport experience, help them start to practice some of these skills that they've had less repetitions with to the point that they become proficient, to the point that they become more confident, more comfortable, more able to execute in a way that works well for them and also for me.
What could this look like? The first thing that comes to my mind is the internet/social media aspect, where some of the coaches didn't have, even for me, like when I was in high school, that was just kind of getting started. How can coaches better relate or have a better relationship with social media, knowing that that's such a frontal part of what these kids are working with? Comparison game, likes, retweets, colleges giving them shout outs. I mean, it's such a huge part. I got to imagine that's got to be a huge part of what you're talking about.
Yeah. And especially when we talk about the need for validation, whether it's from a coach or a peer. And again, this shows up in the, how would you finish kids these days? Like they need constant praise. And we talk in the book about, the difference between praise and affirmation and why it matters, especially with kids these days. But that constant need for reassurance or validation, even for certain elements, especially of sport, that older generations would put into a category of that's just simply part of the job, or, that's just what you do. You don't need to get a gold star for it. So when we think about like what's required, And help me remember the question. I got a little off track there,
Yeah,
DJ.
just how do we help this, the
Oh,
gap here
yeah.
is the social media gap. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, the social media gap. So I first want to own the fact that what we're talking about today and a lot of what I offer coaches is only one side of the conversation. And I love having this conversation with today's athletes. I'll flip it and I'll say, coaches these days, fill in the blank. Like coaches these days, blank, to hear the judgments, the perceptions, the interpretations from the other side. And so if we're only addressing one part of the conversation, when we talk about social media, a lot of older generation coaches have had a very different experience with social media. Like, I am so glad social media was not such a part of my life growing up as an athlete as it is for kids these days. If I was playing a game and I made a mistake, or let's say big mistake, I lost the game because of a decision I made, a turnover that I had, my team loses a championship. If you weren't at the game or on the team, you probably didn't see it. And now a moment of failure for any athlete in any sport recorded on someone's phone can become a meme or can go viral. And so they are reliving that moment of failure over and over and over again. Very different context than older generations. What I often tell coaches is you don't have to be on all the social platforms that they are. Because I think that's sometimes the felt requirement is, okay, if I want to relate to kids these days, then I have to have TikTok, then I have to have Snapchat, then I have to be on all these social spaces. You don't have to be. What you could do is you can ask them what they're watching or what they're seeing. Like, hey, tell me about the newest TikTok dance. I just want to know what the name is so that when somebody says it, I have an understanding of what they're talking about. So again, leaning into curiosity, having conversations with your athletes, utilizing the time they're already spending, the places where they already are, to update or keep current your knowledge or education about those spaces. You don't have to be in the same spaces in order to relate to them about that space.
I love this idea of when working with coaches, and coaches will be like, I want the kids to do this. I want them to be like this. And we're talking a lot about what we want them to be or not to be. And sometimes it's such a great reciprocal of asking the kids, what do you want your coaches to be? And I love this kind of alignment that if we're going to ask the coach to do something, we're going to ask the kid to do the same thing. The behaviors and the standards should be the same. And so I kind of want to backdoor this question by asking, what have you found from talking to Gen Z athletes? What do they want from coaches these days? Instead of going, hey, kids these days, what do they want from coaches these days? What have you found in your kind of interview process and working with kids?
Yeah, a big one, and I talk about this in the second half of the book, using the acronym TEACHERS. I dive into the most important elements in their own words, meaning drawn from athlete interviews, mostly at the college and professional level, of what equates to a quality experience in their sport environment. The T in TEACHERS is transparency. So they value transparency. Where I see this come to a head between coaches and athletes is coaches will say, Betsy, kids today say they want the truth, but then when I tell them the truth, the response does not demonstrate that that's what they wanted. What I hear from athletes is, I want coach to tell me the truth. So we want the same thing. We want to be able, as a coach, to tell our athletes the truth. As athletes, we want to know the truth because we value transparency. So where are we missing each other? And for me, that's what really, through a communication lens, this is where we stand a great opportunity to optimize. Because when we break it down, yes, we both want the truth. How that truth is delivered, where the conversation stops or continues, for me is a big observational differentiator between that conversation being one that's helpful or one that is more harmful to the coach-athlete relationship. So part of what I talk about in the book is this idea of truth plus action. And I hear this all the time from today's athletes. Coach tells me what's wrong, but not how to fix it. And when I relay that to coaches, most coaches from the outset are like, well, that can't be right. Why would any coach do that? Of course, we need them to fix it, so we're going to tell them. It happens in small moments. And it often happens in moments of frustration for coaches. Classic basketball example. If I've got a kid, let's say point guard, last 2 times down the floor has turned it over, then I might say in that moment of frustration for me, you can't keep turning it over. I'm telling them the truth, right? But I don't give them an action. And what the kid is hearing when I say you can't keep turning it over is like, yeah, no kidding. This isn't great for me either, coach. So tell them the truth, but give them an action. If I say in a moment of frustration, you can't keep turning it over, the action might be, if I can't sub them out, which I know is the choice many coaches might make in that context, it's like, hey, next time down the floor, change your body positioning to protect the ball. Make sure you pass with your outside hand. And I think, thinking about Marguerite on your podcast, there was a great clip you had of like, don't tell the problem, tell the solution. That's what kids these days want. They want the truth, but not the truth about their failure and performance, even though that is true. They want the truth about what is actionable, what is controllable by me to do better in the next moment, or to do better or have success in a very similar context in the future. That's the truth they're most interested in. They know they screwed up. You know they screwed up. So while that's true, it's not helpful. And I think that's where a lot of coaches get stuck. I'm giving them feedback. I'm telling them the truth. Is that feedback helpful? If it's not, how can we shift the way that we deliver feedback to be as helpful and supportive as possible without being soft, while still maintaining trust, truth, respect, transparency?
Yes, yes, yes. I want to double click on this. So in the book, you say that 52% of today's athletes cite that the most important quality in leadership is transparency. Coaches, I'm going to say that one more time. 52% of today's athletes say that the most important quality in your leadership is transparency. And one could say it's getting harder and harder to get the truth, being the athlete, and one could say it's getting harder and harder to tell the truth as the coach.
Yes.
So there
you
is
wonder
this,
why we're stuck.
and we're stuck. But like you said, it's a great opportunity for us to close this gap because we're both like feeling the same way. It's almost like if we just get into a room and talk this out, we might be able to come out better. I love Doc Rivers' quote. He said, "Good players want to be coached. Average players want to be left alone. Great players want to be told the truth." So if we all in our agreement, Betsy, hey, they want the truth. I want the truth. I want to be able to give the truth, but for some reason I can't do it. What are we missing here? Is it a simple conversation, or what can coaches do? I love the truth and the action piece. Is there another piece that we're either getting wrong or something that we need to be thinking about when it comes to being transparent and truthful?
Yes. And for me, again, through a communication lens, so much of this, we want this thing. We both want the same thing. What's lacking often is practice. What's lacking often is skill building, repetition, confidence in moments where the stakes are not as high as they are when we actually have to do it. Because if we don't, what we stand to lose is far more impactful. So this is a big thing for me. I'll say, you mentioned a phrase that's irksome to you. One for me that I hear from both coaches as athletes, I'm not comfortable having that conversation. Okay. So long as we prioritize comfort over skill building, we will likely stay in a stuck spot when it comes to actually having today's athletes walk through our door and have a hard conversation with us. If we're not practicing it, if we're not providing opportunities to train what those conversations look like, if we're not modeling with our staff members as coaches what that engagement, that space, that relationship, that conversation looks like in real time during moments of challenge and adversity, I would argue we're not doing all that we could to set our athletes up for success about how they can have those conversations with us, but also with their peers. And I hear it all the time, DJ. Kids these days are afraid to hold each other accountable. Okay, if we unpack fear, what that fear is really about is a lack of skill, a lack of positive experience, and a lack of repetition when the peer relationship is not on the line. And I talk about it in the book, aside from playing time in their sport, the peer relationship, again, largely related to social media, is one of the highest valued currencies for today's athletes. So if we're asking them as coaches to hold each other accountable, but we haven't yet given them tools, skills, repetition in doing that, and in their perception, that accountability conversation might threaten in any way the peer relationship, of course they're afraid to do it. The good news is that is something that we can do something about. We can help them build the skills. We can help model the conversations. We can throw them into challenge scenarios in a low stakes, safe environment to allow them to start to figure out when something really is on the line, how might I go about having this conversation so that it doesn't threaten or deteriorate the peer relationship, it strengthens it.
In your work, consulting and advising, when's a time when you saw a coach deliver truth at a masterclass type level where even you were kind of like, oh wow, that was really beautifully put.
So I'll say recently, last weekend, Maryland women's basketball was here in North Carolina in Greensboro, played an exhibition game against NC State. So preseason number 10, Maryland, preseason number 9, NC State. Really competitive game. Maryland has about half of their roster is new between incoming freshmen and then transfers. And one of the newer players, who was a transfer from Duke, phenomenal first half. I mean, just great first half. And we're in the locker room, and there were some moments in the first half. This is the first time the team is on the floor together. Again, a lot of new pieces. There were a couple times where, just very candidly, we didn't get matched up in transition. Like easy basket for NC State because we missed some defensive assignments and opportunities. And what I noticed that Brenda did, Coach Freeze, is the best player, the best performer, I should say, because there's a lot of great players in that locker room. The best performer in the first half was also the one that she chose to single out and say, you missed a defensive assignment like 2 or 3 times when we were in transition. We said we need to pick up the most dangerous players, not your player, and that's something that we need to address for the second half. So to watch the head coach hold accountable the best performer in that moment, I think oftentimes what I see and hear from a lot of head coaches is, well, I can't criticize my best because I need them to keep performing at that level. And so I'm going to do, something that's easier, more accessible over here, the low-hanging fruit, and I'm going to get on them about this thing. Because if they self-destruct, if they spiral, that's okay. They're probably not going to play that much, in the second half in this context. So whenever an individual, especially someone in, I'll say, a position of power, like a head coach, is willing to call up, hold accountable, model the standards or expectations with the best in that moment, for me, that's a high level of transparency. Because what it's saying is, look, even if you're playing really well, we're still going to hold the line and support the standard when it comes to these things that we know need to improve for the team to be successful. The other way that I see it done masterfully is when a coach takes ownership and accountability for something that they've done that wasn't ideal. And it's wild. We talk about transparency, and everyone's like, yeah, transparency is great. And then consistently throughout sport, the behavior that we expect of athletes, especially during moments of challenge and adversity, something like managing your emotions or controlling your frustration, we do not model the same behavior on the sidelines. And so it's an unfair expectation to have of our athletes to do something in a certain way that represents our team values and standards, and then to excuse ourselves from those same standards. So when that happens, as it organically does, and as soon as possible, and it's not always possible in the moment, but as soon as possible, for a coach to take accountability for their behavior, their words, their actions, if nothing else, you are creating an incredible model for what athletes can choose to do for themselves, with their teammates, or with their coaches at any time. So I think giving them opportunities to practice is one. Being a consistent model for how you can do that is the other thing that I think it takes very little time, and there's so much return on investment from making that choice.
So if we say number 1 is transparency, again, we're talking about what do Gen Z athletes want from their coaches? Transparency, accountability. If I were to ask for a third piece, what do you think they're looking for if we kind of wrap this one up?
They're looking for co-creation. They're looking for a say. And again, this relates to technology. Technology has allowed today's athletes to customize so many elements of their life from a very early age. And this is often an unspoken expectation in their sport experience. They want to have a say. And this is where, the hackles come up from coaches like, it's my program, it's my team, it's my way. And in the book, I tell the story about a very successful, longtime collegiate softball coach. And in our first meeting, in the background on the wall, there's a painting, and it says, "Because I said so." And right away, we've just met, right? And I'm like, hey, great to meet you. Quick question, what's that about, on the background? And she's like, oh, my assistant made that for me because I say it all the time. I was like, great. I need for us to start the conversation by talking about why that's no longer effective, and it would benefit you to never say that again. And the next session that we had, there was a new painting. It was one of their stadium that was in the background. I said, hey, I like the new artwork. Like, tell me what happened. She said, Betsy, I heard you and I'm ready to learn more. And so just being able to co-create, it's not enough because we said so. Every coach that I've ever talked with, when they tell me what they want from their athletes, we want greater ownership. We want greater engagement. We want greater investment, commitment, accountability, pride. Yes, you get all of those things when you make the choice to co-create with today's athlete. Now, how you co-create is absolutely up to you. I'm not saying they get a say in everything based on their likes, dislikes, preferences of the moment. I'm saying when you're intentional about co-creating the sport experience, the team environment, the values, the standards, the expectations, even the consequences, then because they've been part of that creation, they are much more aligned with where you're going and what you're doing and how you're doing it. So we all get more of what we want when we co-create. So absolutely, like transparency, yes. Accountability, yes. Co-creation, essential. If you want to work well with today's athletes, we have to be able to give them choices. The degree of choice we give them, in what areas, at what time, you get to make that decision as a coach. But if you want to work well with kids these days, we've got to give them choices.
When I hear co-creation, I hear player-led, and I believe that player-led teams are better than coach-led teams. What
Yeah.
are some ways, and again, this is going to be very sport dependent, age dependent. It's a very generic question, Betsy, but just take a stab at what are some ways that coaches can create a more player-led team depending on, their environment, what sport they're in. What are some strategies that you've seen have been very beneficial?
Co-creation is one, right? So being very clear about what they can choose to take ownership of, the ways in which they can do that. And also, I'll say the word that comes to mind is humbling yourself a little bit, like putting yourself in a more supportive position. So we'd love for this to be a player-led program. Let's talk about what needs to be true for that to be the felt experience of the people in this program, and also how we as your coaching staff can support that reality. So I'd say that's one piece. Another is, even when it comes to the standards for your program, the expectations, because especially in today's sport landscape, so many problems, whether relationally between a coach and athlete, or problems that actually impact a coach's professional longevity in the sport, arise from unspoken expectations. I, as a player, have or hold these expectations of you as a coach or of my sport experience that I haven't actually expressed, but they're true for me. And now frustration, resentment, and fractured relationships start to build up in that space. So how do we unearth those as soon as possible? If we're going to have a player-led program, then what's required from a coaching perspective when I talk about the expectations for being part of this program is, instead of telling, I need to ask. Or more specifically, in addition to telling, I need to ask. And I'm a big fan of putting the asking first. So I'm going to ask the athletes, as an athlete in this program, what do you expect of your coaches? I'm also going to ask, as an athlete in this program, what can your coaches expect of you? And then I'm going to share, as an athlete in this program, this is what we as coaches expect of you, and here's what you can expect of us. And if we're really going to do this in a very intentional way, I'm going to ask those first two questions from the athlete perspective. They write down their answers. And then as I share my expectations as a coach and what they can expect of me, I invite them to cross off anything that I've covered. Because now what we have left on each athlete's page are unspoken expectations. And then I might use some form of, live polling, something like Mentimeter, where in an anonymous way, because I don't yet need to know exactly who holds what expectation. I simply need to know that these expectations exist. So I'll invite athletes to put whatever's left on their paper that's not crossed out onto the screen. And then I'm going to lead with gratitude, like, thank you for sharing expectations so that we know what we're working with. And we can be intentional about having conversations to create shared expectations and shared understanding around what we're really about in this program, so that you can be the player-led program that you aspire to be.
Let's double click on expectations. My dad taught me this quote that agreements prevent disagreements, right?
Yeah.
Agreements prevent disagreements. It's simple, but it's also brilliant at the same time. What I think about this is, Dawn Staley has talked about, she does Zoom calls every month with the parents of the kids she coaches. I mean, you talk about doing something that's
Yeah.
not in your contract. And what a great model of, hey, I'm always on the same page and I'm communicating expectations. This, I think, is a huge part that gets gets missed for coaches because perhaps coaches want to get right into practice, right into X's and O's, right into game plan, and like, hey, you guys were here last year, so let's just continue this thing and keep going.
Yeah.
So what do you wish more coaches knew about laying out expectations? How can we demystify some of this area? Because I think if we don't get this right, we could see some trouble down the road. It might not be right away game one, but several weeks
Yeah.
down, we're like, dang, I wish I would have. I can't go back now. What do you wish coaches knew about it, setting expectations?
So so much. And again, this is not so much of like, oh, coaches these days are so ignorant. It's that I see so many coaches struggle. And when I say struggle, I mean individually with athletes. I mean at different points of their season. I mean with the profession to the point that they're wondering if they can do this anymore. And it doesn't have to be that way. So to your point, DJ, the setting expectations piece, the clarifying expectations piece, and my version of that phrase, I have a friend and colleague, Chico Rigo. He's currently the head swimming and diving coach at George Washington University. He's Brazilian, and there's this beautiful phrase in Portuguese that means the agreed upon is never expensive. And for me, that fits perfectly into setting expectations. So what do we need to agree upon? And here's the other thing. Agreement doesn't mean that we like it. And I think that's a sticking point for a lot of people. Well, I don't agree. Is that true? Do you have shared values? Are there ways where we're both asking for the same thing, but perhaps the way that we're going about it is the thing that we dislike? So can we agree? And one of the examples I'll give is a workshop that I often do with athletes. I'll say, okay, raise your hand if you feel like accountability is important for individual and team success. I've yet to have it happen where not every hand in the room goes up. And I'll follow that with a question. I'll say, okay, thanks for that. Now, I'd like you to raise your hand if you've been held accountable or you've held someone else accountable, and for you, that was not a positive or productive experience. Without fail, over half the hands will go up. So if we all know and value accountability, but most of us are not consistently having a positive, and by positive, I don't mean feels good. I mean positive for the relationship, positive for the goals of the team or organization. If we're not having that positive experience, what's that about? And it's the same thing for setting expectations. If we all agree expectations are important to know, but we're missing something in how we're having those conversations, then that's something we can remedy. And I think the other thing that comes up for me often with coaches is, well, I've allowed this to go on for a certain duration of time. I can't fix it now. I'm going to have to wait until next season to put that in. Absolutely not. And I can't remember right now if this is in the book. If it's not, I know I have an ACT video about it on YouTube. Those are the short active communication technique videos. There's something that I call the 4 R's. And the 4 R's are recognize, restate, restart, reinforce. So at any time when you notice, gosh, there's an expectation I wish I would have set at the beginning of the season, I didn't, and now it's causing problems. Perfect time to use the 4 R's. So the recognize is about taking ownership. You're going to take ownership for anything that you've done or not done that has allowed the issue to exist in the way it currently does. So I might say, I recognize that before today, I was never very clear about what my expectations are for this category, and that's on me. So you're going to take ownership for something you've done or haven't done that has allowed things to exist in the way they currently do. The second part, restate. This is about purpose. So you're going to restate the purpose or value behind whatever expectation you're about to set. Restart. This is usually the shortest part of the conversation. It involves any phrase that differentiates what was to what will be in the future. Phrases like starting today, from here on out, or moving forward, so that we're using language to create a difference in space. And then reinforce. Reinforce is about consistency. Sometimes it's about, I'll say, consequences. Sometimes it's about resetting standards or expectations based off of current reality. So recognize, restate, restart, reinforce. You can create, or I'll say, you can invite athletes into a new set of expectations at any time. What's first required is that you make it known that this is new and a missed opportunity from the past that you'd like to remedy now. Like, there are ways that we can do these things. And a phrase I often find myself saying is, These are not conversations we commonly have, but we can. Anybody can. And the more we talk about, the more clarity we have, the better experience for all. So does it take time? Yes. But what will it cost you if you don't have this conversation? What might it cost you as a team? What might it cost you as an individual? What might it cost you professionally in this profession to not have this conversation? That's what I invite coaches to consider when they say, well, I don't have the time. I get it. And I know you're so busy. And I think that perhaps, and I don't mean this to be judgmental, but perhaps looking at the totality of things we need to do and then reprioritizing based off of the experience we say we want to have. We want to have a player-led program. Okay, to have a player-led program, what are the most important elements to spend time on outside of the X's and O's? And how can we be intentional about building that time into our training, not in addition to our training, but making it part of what we do? Because when you take time in practice or training to work on certain things that are more conversationally based, the message that you're sending to the athletes is this matters. This isn't, we're going to do what we want to do as coaches, and then we're going to ask for more of your time outside of practice, outside of weight training, outside of whatever else it happens to be, to figure this out. We're saying we know this is so important that we're going to take the time in training today to be really intentional about working on it together.
Another piece that I would like to get your opinion on that I feel like Gen Z athletes want from their coaches is they don't want to be yelled at, Betsy.
Oh man, yeah.
And I don't think anybody wants to be yelled at, but when I think about perhaps old school coaching, old school athletes, and again, this is just my bias, is just my example. I think there was a lot more yelling back in the day than there is now.
Yes.
And now yelling is a lot different. Like, you might talk at this conversation and a kid goes, yeah, coach is just yelling at me. And you're like, we were having a conversation about this volume.
Yes.
So we're very sensitive to tone and volume of voice. If you agree that Gen Z athletes don't want to be yelled at, and that's a little bit of a barrier with some of these older coaches, what can we learn about overall volume, yelling? What do coaches need to know about this piece?
Yeah, so first set the expectation, right? Like to your point, I changed my tone or I raised my volume and now I yelled at them in a way that was detrimental or negative or, so set the expectation. Like, hey, there's going to be certain moments given our sport where I need to increase my volume and my tone might sound different because of the context. Like yelling, I think, and again, this is a conversation we don't often have in part because bias of older generations, I was yelled at. Like I've yet to meet an older coach that at some point in their sport didn't have a coach that yelled at them. And this is sport specific. So it would be weird for a golf coach to yell on the course at an athlete. So it all depends on context, but most older generations played for, grew with, experienced a coach that yelled. And they have a very visceral memory of what that experience was like. So anytime I'm not doing what was done to me, I'm not yelling. But for kids these days, the baseline is different. So if I haven't had coaches that have raised their voice, even if what they're saying is positive, I might interpret that as yelling, even though it's not meant to be, but it has a different meaning. So setting expectations, we can clarify what is yelling, what isn't yelling, what is yelling's purpose. And even when I talk about yelling with coaches, one of the things we first have to create some clarity around is when I talk about yelling, I'm not talking about instances where, given the context or the sport that you're involved in, you have to raise your volume or voice to cover space, or it's a loud arena, or I don't have a timeout. And so I have to communicate in a way that sounds like yelling objectively. When I'm talking about yelling and the kind of yelling that's not effective with today's student athletes, we're talking about yelling for the purpose of shame, blame, humiliation, criticism, degradation, like continuing down that path. And again, baseline question for me, is it helpful? Here's the challenge. For coaches that are yellers, and sometimes I'll ask for that level of vulnerability in a workshop. I'll say, I'm a little vulnerability here. If you're willing, if you self-describe as a yeller, please raise your hand, okay? And then we've got a few people. It does typically tend to be males. It's not gender specific. I'll ask, when you yell, what's your purpose? Most frequent response I hear, I want to see an immediate change in behavior. The problem is that the yelling is reinforced because what coaches often get is an immediate change in behavior. However, we have to look past the immediate to the longer impact. Long term, if I as an athlete exist in a program where I am not sure the next time my coach is going to pop off, who it's going to be directed at, what's going to happen to that person, that is not a psychologically safe environment for me to operate in. And if we look at the long-term effects of operating in an environment where fear is present, that doesn't facilitate sustained high performance. So you want an immediate change in behavior, you yell, you get it. In the moment, that's a win. Over time, absolutely a loss. If you say you're committed to high performance, if you want your team to be at its best, there is likely a more effective way to communicate what is challenging for you and what you need to see from them. And that's what I invite coaches into.
You have a story, I think, that relates really well to this when you visited the Las Vegas Raiders. Can you tell that story?
Yeah. So the first time I was out in Vegas working with the Raiders, the first day that I was there was an off day for the players. And so my point of contact was touring me around beautiful, like insanely beautiful facility. And we were crossing through the dining facility and there was a player on the other side. And my point of contact stopped me. He said, "Betsy, hold on for a second." And he said, "Hey, Jacoby, come over here." So Jacoby Myers comes over and shakes my hand. We chat for a minute. And then my point of contact says, "Betsy's going to work with the coaches tomorrow. What advice would you have for coaches about how to best coach a guy like you?" Without hesitation, DJ, he said, "Talk to me. Don't yell at me. Talk to me. I'm not going to listen to the loudest guy in the room. I'm going to listen to the guy that's talking to me like he has something to teach me. Like I'm somebody he respects, like a brother or a friend or a son." $30 million over 3 years to catch a football. And what he wanted from his coaches is for them to talk to him. And this is in football, like a sport historically known for yelling, for volume. And he wants to be talked to. And I've heard that echoed by so many of today's athletes. They want to do well. They also want you to talk to them. And they've gotten really good at tuning you out if you're simply yelling at them.
There's a couple questions that you like to ask and you put in the book, and I think they're brilliant. I'd love to break them down. There's two of them. We'll do one at a time. The first one is, what does your whistle mean? Why is this so important?
It's so important because, again, change starts at the level of awareness, right? So if you've yet to ask yourself that question and you are a coach that uses a whistle, it can be a really insightful question to ask. And I love asking this question of players in a program. What does your coach's whistle mean? Because it's immediately telling the type of environment, the expectations that are present for what happens after the whistle. So as a coach, if I'm only ever blowing my whistle to correct a mistake, my athletes know that. So when I blow the whistle, before I say anything, there is already a defensiveness, like a tightening up of like, oh, who made the mistake? Who's coach coming for? Are you also blowing your whistle with some degree of regularity to stop play, to celebrate something that was good, right? So what does your whistle mean to you? If you've never thought about that question, start to catalog or inventory. When do I tend to blow my whistle and for what purpose? And you can also ask your players, like, hey, what does my whistle mean? Oh, coach, if you blow the whistle, it means somebody's in trouble, right? If you blow the whistle, it means we're getting on the line. Like, what does it mean to them? And then how can you be intentional about creating more of the, I'll say, consistency between criticism and celebration so that at best, your athletes don't yet know what your whistle means. And here's the advantage for coaches. When you blow your whistle and your athletes don't yet know why the whistle is blown, because it could equally be criticism or celebration, their ears are wide open. Yeah, they might be hoping for, hey, coach is going to shout me out or tap me up for doing something well. But you've got their attention in a different way than if they know when that whistle blows, something's coming, so I better protect myself.
In your experience being around some of the best coaches in the country, Betsy, what would you say percentage-wise when it comes to feedback? How much time are they spending on praise and how much time are they spending on criticism? What would you say?
I would actually shift the language if I could.
Please.
And say it's less about time spent on praise and more about opportunities for group learning or recognition
Okay.
of what's helpful or facilitating success, individually or collectively.
Okay, let's break that
So,
down.
yeah, they're going to pause or they're going to take time, because anytime you've stopped training or you've stopped the play that's going on, you're preventing that forward progression through the practice plan. They're going to take time intentionally to pause, to create space for the purpose of generating awareness around how something that happened in that moment, individually or collectively, is facilitating more of what we're committed to or in pursuit of as a team. So it's less about praise, more about creating awareness. And the same is true on the criticism piece. When they stop play to criticize or to give feedback, what I observe the best of the best doing is they're not telling, they're asking. Because they understand that when I ask, I'm getting information that I may not already know. Even though I am well-versed, well-experienced in coaching this sport, there's likely some piece of information that I don't yet know that I could get through asking, and or how they ask the question facilitates a greater level of engagement or learning for all.
I would love
So
to
yeah,
hear
it
an
would be
example.
really,
Can you share an example of that?
I think the example I might use in the book, if I'm remembering correctly, because I do this often, is I'm going to go basketball example. If my team is scrimmaging and as we're in transition, given where the ball is on the floor, I see a defensive player that's out of position. Very easy, very expedient, and that's part of the challenge, time, right? So it's always faster to tell than it is to ask. But we get a different level of learning individually and collectively when we ask instead of tell. So if I notice a player's out of position, very expedient for me to blow the whistle and say, hey, when the ball's there, you need to be there. And to tell that individual. Completely different experience for that individual and the team when in the same scenario, I blow my whistle and say, hey, when the ball's there, where do you need to be? Yes, I'm asking that individual, but everybody else, not just the defense, but the offense as well, is considering how would they answer that question if they were asked. You've also facilitated a moment of opportunity for peer support. Because let's say you're a new member of the program, hey, when the ball's here, where do you need to be? And they're like, it is very likely, and I've seen it happen consistently, a teammate nearby on defense will say, hey, midline, like you're close, get over here. So opportunity for peer engagement, peer support, if nothing else, teachable moment for the group instead of just for the individual. Now, where I get pushback on that sometimes is, okay, but you said when the ball's here, where do you need to be? Now you've singled out that athlete. And the worst interpretation that I hear that's very problematic for coaches is targeting. Coaches targeting me in practice. Whereas if you ask the coaches, they're like, no, but Betsy, I'm coaching them. Like I'm coaching them. Players and parents, unfortunately, and again, this is facilitated through social media, have learned how to weaponize language for situations that they naturally or organically encounter in sport. Which is why, again, not a conversation we typically have, but one I feel would benefit every coach at every level. Start with asking your players, what's the difference between being called out and called up? And ask them, don't tell them, this is calling you out, this is calling you up. Ask them, break them into small groups, have them come up with the difference between the two. And then when I do this in groups, I will write on a whiteboard that they can see on the screen everything they say about called out, everything that they say about called up. What's interesting without fail is there's often the exact same thing on one side as the other. And just like those unspoken expectations, those are sometimes the most important ones to address so that in a moment where I'm doing something for individual and team benefit, it's not misinterpreted on the side that I and the athlete don't want to be on. So have the conversation. If you're not yet having it, you can at any time. And it's going to create greater understanding, greater ease, greater interpretation in a positive way for you and for them, much fewer problems. Anytime we can address issues before they become problems, that is a win for everybody.
I'm loving this conversation. The next question that you ask or want to put a preface on asking is the difference between what's the most effective way to coach you versus how do you like to be coached. This was this opened my eyes a little bit. I haven't heard it this way before. Can you lay it out for the listeners that haven't heard this yet?
Absolutely. And I just published a blog post about this on Substack yesterday. So if you'd like it, in writing to refer to, just check out Substack. This is one of those things that I see, DJ, often, and I'll say if I had to concisely say, what do you do as a communication specialist? Communication is a very broad term, so I get to play in a lot of different spaces. But what I do in all of those spaces is seek to bring into closer proximity intention and impact. Is what I said and how I said it received as intended or not?
I like that.
This is absolutely one of those examples where, with great intention, a coach will ask an athlete, how do you like to be coached? Okay, I want to know, how can I work really well with them? The challenge is in how the question is worded. Because if I ask an athlete, DJ, how do you like to be coached? And you're very clear, very specific about how you like to be coached. At some point in the future, there's likely going to be a moment in time where I need to coach you differently, because that's what the context or situation necessitates. What happens in that moment is when I coach DJ differently, even though DJ's very clearly told me how he likes to be coached, now that's interpreted or taken personally, even though that's not the intention. So when I coach you differently, even though I know what you like, now that must mean I don't like you or I don't care, which is not at all true for the coach. We can mitigate that experience by changing how we ask the question. Instead of how do you like to be coached, what's the most effective way to coach you? Because even if you give me the exact same answer as if I asked how do you like to be coached, now when I do something differently because that's what the sport or the game or the situation necessitates, it's not taken personally. At worst, that player's thinking, oh, well, coach isn't being as effective as they could be, but it's not personal because I didn't use the word like. I used the word effective. And it's these small changes in how we communicate that can have a huge impact, not just on the individual relationship or the results, but the environment, the way that we experience sport together.
I love what you said about intention and impact and closing that gap. That's really creative, really cool. Is there anything else that comes to mind? I'm sure there's a lot. Is there anything else that comes to mind where the coach has the right intention, but the impact just isn't happening? I just like those little, like bite-sized type things. Is there anything else that comes to mind?
Two. One is little, and I say it's little, it's also big. And it's biggest in our more challenging conversations. And I know they're often called difficult conversations. I'm a big fan of rephrasing those to be important conversations, because the reason why they are often challenging or difficult is because we're talking about things that matter deeply to us. So if we're going to have an important conversation, one of the smallest shifts that I'll say differentiates between intention and impact that serves to close that gap is replacing the word but with and. If you listen, and when I say listen, if you listen to how you speak for most people in an average day, we often say the word but in places where we could have said and. So the invitation for anyone listening is start to pay attention. Start to listen to, as you go through various conversations throughout your day with all sorts of people, when do you notice yourself saying the word but? And ask yourself, could I have said and there? And if I did, what difference might it have made? An example I love to use, it's a very different experience for an athlete. If a coach says, Betsy, I think you're doing a great job. I'm like, yes. And then they say, but, and I'm like, ah. Versus if a coach said, Betsy, I think you're doing a great job. Yes. And like my ears are open. As a competitor, I want to get better. I want to hear what's next. I also want to retain that validation, that affirmation of you're doing a great job. Changing the language can make that true, especially in our more important conversations. Can we tell the truth and then not say but? Because what happens in that moment is, even though I've been very clear about the truth, when I say but, it's like, that's out. And now they're focused on the second piece. So if we're looking for small shifts, the difference between and but when we choose to use those words, and I want to be really clear in saying it's not, the invitation is not to never say but. Mm-hmm. It's can we be intentional about the times that we say but, so that we are intentionally setting up that contrast, intentionally differentiating between one thing and another. Or would it benefit us more to say and, so that two things get to be true, even though they might be very different things? Another one that comes up frequently in a coaching context, and again, high intention, unintended negative impact. If, let's say, you want to talk about your playing time, and so you come in and you've got great intention as an athlete, coach, what do I need to do, or what can I work on that will increase my likelihood of earning competitive playing time? So we go through everything you can control. And this conversation is unique between you and I, DJ, because I'm an athlete who is very mature, and I'm not talking about other people. I'm just focusing the conversation on myself. So already great conversation. Coach is excited. They get really clear. They tell the truth. They're transparent. They give action steps. And then because they know how important it is, with great intention, they say some version of, given what we've talked about today, can you summarize for me like what you're taking away or what you understand? Okay. And then the athlete repeats back exactly as if we'd written it or scripted it, what they need to do in order to earn playing time. So we think, great, we're on the same page. But here's what I routinely see happen. The coach leaves that conversation thinking we had a great conversation, they understand. The athlete leaves the conversation thinking, when I do these things, I'm going to play. Which if you ask the coach, what the coach is leaving with is only when you do these things, do you give yourself a chance at possibly playing. Small difference, big impact. And it often shows up at the end of a season when a player says on an anonymous survey, I did everything coach told me to do to earn playing time and still never played. So we've just missed each other, but in a really big way. So a question that I encourage all coaches to ask anytime you have important conversations, once you've clarified, once you've passed that good intention of, can you repeat back to me or can you summarize what you understand from this meeting? Make the last question that you ask before you leave that space. Given what we've talked about today, what are your expectations moving forward? Because if I asked in that moment, the athlete would say, well, I expect that when they do these things, I'm going to play, which is a great opportunity for the coach to say, thank you for sharing that. Because here's what's true for me. Only when you do these things do you give yourself an opportunity to compete for playing time. There's no guarantee. So I want to be really clear about that. Now we don't have the same issue. We're so close and we have such good intention and we are missing each other in small moments.
Number 2, highlight what matters most. How can coaches do this?
Yeah, leading with the why. I mean, before, I say this often, kids these days are uninterested in what you want them to do until they first understand why it's important or what value it holds for them. And at the outset, DJ, that can sound really selfish. Again, it's related to an upbringing with technology. They've been able to Google at any time, any question that's on their mind. So they're constantly indexing for information. As a coach, it's critically important before we give them the what, we tell them the why. Even if we do it in a slightly different order. So we might say, in a minute, we're going to be working on this skill area because, or the value of working on this skill area, or the purpose of doing this drill right now is so that we can, and then you can list the benefits individually and collectively. Relevance. If I had to summarize there, like highlight what matters most, we need to be able to articulate the relevance of what we're asking an athlete to do before we ask them to do it. Because they might be listening to us if we're telling them what we're about to do next, but what they're also wondering in the back of their mind is, okay, but why? Like, what's the purpose? What's the value? How does this apply to me?
And what doesn't work there is what that coach said, because I said so. So give them the why beyond that.
Yeah,
Great.
skip that. Yeah.
Number 3, exit the chat and expand.
Yeah. Okay. Exit the chat and expand. Again, technologically based. When I was growing up, and again, I was born in 83, so I'm 42. When I was growing up, we had 3 ways that you could connect with someone. You could talk to them on the phone, you could write them a letter, or you could talk to them face to face. 3 ways. Infinite expansion of the number of ways that people can connect digitally. That's always been true for kids these days. So conversational comfort zone for many of today's athletes is they are chat-based. And when we say chat-based, it's easy to think texting. I invite coaches to expand that to mean short exchanges of information, even when it's face-to-face. So exit the chat and expand is really about intentional ways that coaches can help young players or Gen Z, like modern athletes, start to develop a more diverse and robust skill set around face-to-face communication. So if they're starting in the chat, we need to be able to invite them into a different space. And the joke I make in the book is, I love when they text you and you call them and they don't pick up. It's like, but you just, and it happens all the time. So if chat is the conversational comfort zone, invite them to take it off of text. It doesn't mean that they'll accept the invitation, but if we don't invite as coaches, they are very comfortable staying in that space. So when they text you and you know it's an important conversation to have, can you extend an invitation? Hey, it sounds like this is important to chat about. Can we hop on a quick phone call? Can I FaceTime you? Can we meet before or after practice tomorrow? Create an invitation to exit the chat.
Number 4, share ownership of the process.
Yes, this is all about co-creation. And I like to joke there's an infinite number of ways to co-create, but I also believe that's true. What limits us is often our or our perception about what we as coaches should be responsible for and what they as athletes should be responsible for. Co-creation is essential for working well with the modern athlete. The way in which you co-create, or the ways, because there are so many, that is a choice that you get to make. What's essential is creating the invitation, the guidelines of the invitation, or the specifics of the event you're inviting them into, so to speak. That is a decision that you will always get to make. So how creative, how responsive, how dynamic, how thoughtful and intentional can you be about co-creating to not only elevate the quality of the sport experience for the athlete, but also to create what every coach says they want: greater ownership, greater accountability, greater engagement, greater investment.
Again, if you're just tuning in, 8 strategies for winning with kids these days. We're on number 5. Turn data into discussions.
This is a great one. Okay. What we know from the research about Gen Z, Gen Alpha is, again, because they've had access to information at their fingertips for their entire life, they are very data driven. So the invitation for coaches is, how can you use data to support individual and team success? And there's a variety of ways that we can do this. Organically, it's happening in many sports through sports analytics. We're getting the feedback based off of an individual's output or performance. How do we use the data to frame conversations that allow us to connect, but also to foster or support their growth and development, whether it's in a skill area, whether it's in their sport in general, or whether it's in, I don't yet have this experience and I want to. Okay, what's the data? What are the metrics around how we can measure your progress towards what you say you want, but you've yet to experience?
Could be another great way to be transparent and truthful is to use the data.
Absolutely.
Number 6, we've talked about this a little bit already. Deliver actionable feedback.
Yeah, one that we didn't touch on. I know I talked about truth plus action before, DJ. One I didn't talk on that for me is critically important. This idea of criticize and connect. First, when or before you criticize, connect. Today's athletes are wholly uninterested in your feedback until they first know unequivocally that you have their back. So start there. Start with the relationship. Before you criticize, connect. And then when you criticize, connect. And what I mean by that is, when you offer some form of feedback, can you be intentional about connecting it to something that you know that individual values or is in pursuit of? And it's not just for kids these days. This is really effective for people of all ages. Offer the feedback, give the criticism, and be intentional about connecting it to something that you know they value or that they're in pursuit of. When we do that, people are much more receptive to the feedback that we have to offer.
Number 7, cultivate internal motivation. This could probably be an episode on its own. What's your what's your flyover on internal motivation?
Okay, so one of the challenges for many coaches, and I'll say for today's athletes, is in large part due to technology, specifically social media. Gen Z, Gen Alpha has been disproportionately conditioned to value the opinions of others. And I know across human history we'll say it's like, oh, you shouldn't care what others people think. Most people do. Kids these days absolutely do. And that's been reinforced through different social spaces. So how do we help them develop an internal drive for motivation? Oftentimes coaches will approach this through a growth mindset. Even the language that we use. An example I give in the book is, I was watching a water polo practice, and what I heard the coach say to an athlete was, it looks like you're making the right mistakes. And just the juxtaposition of the word right and mistakes. And I talk about in the book, because failure has been amplified in, the echo chambers of technology, many young people today have a difficult time separating out, I've experienced a failure, from I am a failure. For them, these are intricately linked. So how, through language, through skills and drills, through repetition, through modeling, can we start to extract those two things and teach them failure's role in success? To cultivate, I'm going to do this thing because I know I can. I'm going to do this thing because I'm excited to see what's on the other side of it. I'm going to do this thing not because I'm fearless, but because I acknowledge the fear and I'm choosing this growth. These are things that we can do. And it's really challenging. Again, very much falls into that bucket of Betsy, who has the time? Also, critically important, if we hope to see and experience the athletes in our program having that pursuit, that drive, that competitiveness that we had, that we judge them for not having, and that we say we really want.
That's such a huge topic. The number 8 one is another big one. Build the will to wait.
Ooh, instant gratification. And I hear this, that kids these days phrase, like they want everything now. Yeah, and technology has made that possible. I even had a member of Gen Z come up to me after a workshop and say, Betsy, I often hear coaches talk about my generation as entitled. And the reality is technology has made it so easy for us to get what we want that I get it. Like we are entitled in that way, but we've never known life any differently. So teaching the will to wait. How can you help athletes practice working towards a desired outcome over time? Even to the point, and I love this, like that phrase, what will your future self thank you for? How can you give them something controllable, actionable that they can do today to feel that they are making progress towards the outcome they want right now, but they can't yet have? Even being able to be intentional about that is helping them practice the will to wait. I can't have that thing and I want it really, I got now. Okay, can't have it yet, but here's what you can have, and here's what you can do. And if you put this on repeat, you're going to find yourself closer to that thing you really want, but can't yet have. We need to help them practice. Technology has facilitated instant gratification. Practicing, waiting, the space between, that's something that they could use a little bit of support to develop.
Betsy, this has been phenomenal. And I didn't book another call after this because I knew I wanted to talk to you for a long time. So thank you for sticking around a little bit extra here. I really appreciate it. You and I fly the same flag in many ways, and we're doing a lot of a similar work. And I learned a lot from you, researching you and listening to podcasts you've been on and the book. I'm telling you, it's so good. How can my listeners get a hold of Kids These Days, effective strategies for coaching Gen Z and beyond? The floor is yours to promote.
Yeah, thank you. I found out yesterday the book is leaving the printing house and en route to the distribution center. So paperback copies will be available. They're already available on my website. If you go to betsybutterick.com, you can snag a copy right now. Eventually, probably within a week or so, you'll be able to order through Amazon. The Kindle version of the book is already available on Amazon. What I'd love to do, DJ, is I'd like to offer your listeners a discount on the book. So after today, I'll send you a code. And if listeners click on the code in the show notes, you won't get the same discount if you go through Amazon or the website. But if you want a discount on the book and you value this professional resource, please use the link in the show notes to get a discounted copy of the book. My biggest purpose is I want this out in the world doing the good that it can do. So more than happy to offer that for listeners, and everything else, whether it's connecting on social media, you can find through betsybutterick.com. I'm most active on Instagram and LinkedIn just because everything takes so much time. But yeah, I just so appreciate being able to have this conversation. Same. I wish we had like 2 hours. I mean, I know we could go off the rails onto some topics we haven't even touched on yet, but really appreciate the opportunity to share this resource with people and also just have a quality conversation. So thank you.
Betsy, let's keep in touch. And thank you for your time and your wisdom.
My pleasure.